This lesson is about relative frequency. Now, before I talk about relative frequency, let's talk about the theoretical probability of an experiment. So let's say if we toss a coin. If we toss a coin and we have heads and tails, then we know, in theory, that the probability of heads and the probability of tails is a half. However, if we do an experiment, we know this is not necessarily going to be the case, because I could throw a coin 10 times and I might get heads, tails, tails, heads, 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 tails. What's that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Heads and heads. And that's just randomness of throwing a coin or tossing a coin. So in this case, if we just looked at this experiment, that experiment would tell us that the heads, probability of getting heads, would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 out of 10, and the probability of getting tails is 3 out of 10. Now we know in theory that's not correct, but the more times we toss a coin, the closer these numbers here would become these numbers here. Okay, but on a small experiment, on a small scale, we're not going to get our numbers in theory. That leads us to relative frequency. Relative frequency is essentially our experimental probability. Let's look at the formula. So relative frequency, it says the frequency of the data value of what we want divided by the total number of data values. Okay, the formula is very similar to our formula when working out probability in theory. Let's look at this question and see what we mean. An experiment of tossing 2 coins was completed and the number of heads recorded in the frequency table shown. Find the relative frequency for attaining 0 heads, 1 head, or 2 heads. So, the frequency of our data values. These are the numbers. These numbers here are the numbers that are going to be on the top of our fraction. The total number of data values we don't have yet. That's the total number of times we've tossed the coin, or tossed the 2 coins. And this is the total of our frequency here. So the first thing we need to do is we need to add up our total frequency. And that will tell us the bottom of our fraction. So if we add these up quickly, we will get 200, 300, 400. Okay, so that basically tells us that we've tossed the 2 coins 400 times. 400 times. And through that 400 times, no heads came up 100 times. 1 head came up 192 times, and 2 heads came up 108 times. So let's work out our relative frequencies. Now, relative frequencies, as mentioned up here, can be expressed as fractions, decimals, or percentages. So let's do both. Let's all do all 3, not both. Goodness me. Let's do all 3 and see how we go. So, the relative frequency for 0 heads would be 100 over 400. Now if I simplify that, that becomes 1 over 4, which is a quarter, which is the same as 0.25, or 25%. Now over here, I'm just going to write it as simplified fraction, which is 1 over 4 a quarter. find the relative frequency of obtaining one head. Okay, so that's going to be 192 over 400. Now we're going to simplify that in our calculator and do 192 over 400, and that equals 12 over 25. Now, as a decimal, you calculate it back, we'll hit the LSD button, and it's 0.48. And to change it to a percent, we're just going to take that decimal on our calculator and times it by 100, which equals 48%. But over on our table here, we're just going to write it as the fraction, 12 out of 25. Now the last one, the relative frequency of two heads is going to be 108 out of 400. So we'll get our calculator and get our fractions button and do 108 over 400 equals 27 over 100. That makes it easy for a decimal, which is 0.27 or 27%. So I'll write 27 over 100 here. Alright, let's see how you go with the worksheet.